Private members' business. Notice number 3 for a motion relating to aircraft traffic.
I call the member for Brisbane.
Thank you, Speaker. I move the motion relating to aircraft traffic in the terms in which it appears on the notice paper. Air Services Australia's last annual report showed more complaints for Brisbane Airport than all other major Australian airports combined. Since the opening of the new parallel runway, I've heard from many constituents that flight noise is acutely impacting the community, especially when they're trying to sleep. As the former Labor Prime Minister Kevin Rudd said himself, aircraft noise is a major problem for many people in Brisbane's suburbs. There are increasing numbers of night flights disturbing people's sleep. I believe the only solution is an introduction of a night curfew. Everybody has a right to a decent night's sleep. Health data clearly illustrates that flight noise has a direct effect on well-being and is linked to lower quality of life, poorer well-being and psychological ill health. This needs to be fixed. The residents of Brisbane should have the same rights as other Australians, the right to a good night's sleep.
Thank you.
The Brisbane Airport Corporation's ambition is to double flights over the city by 2035. The government's own aviation green paper predicts a tripling of flight movements by 2050. This stands to significantly increase noise, CO2 emissions and air pollution. This is not an issue that is just going to go away. Now, last week, the Greens secured a big concession from the federal government, which could see hundreds more flights taking off and landing over the water, rather than the homes of Brisbane residents. As a result of Greens and community pressure, the Transport Minister agreed to direct Air Services Australia to operate both runways at Brisbane Airport over the water at once, when safe to do so, subject to approval from the Airspace Advisory Board. This mode is called SODPROPS mode, or Simultaneous Opposite Direction Parallel Runway Operations. Now, SODPROPS mode is not always possible, particularly when weather conditions make it unsafe. However, this commitment secured under Greens and community pressure will mean the government must report clearly to the community on the share of flights going over the water. And on occasions where SODPROPS can't be used, the government must report on the reasons why, allowing the Brisbane community to hold the airport and Air Services Australia to account for these decisions. And once implemented, this concession could see the biggest reduction in flight noise since the opening of the second runway. These kinds of results are only possible because residents in the community have been making their voices heard. And I want to say thank you to everyone who has letterboxed, shared petitions, come to rallies, sent emails and helped build this movement. Now, we remain committed to this cause and we won't rest until we've won lasting protections. We will continue to campaign for a cap and a curfew. By introducing reasonable restrictions, such as implementing a nighttime curfew on flights from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m, we can sustainably reduce aircraft noise across Brisbane. Now, noise reduction mechanisms like this are already in place and providing relief for other communities near airports across Australia, including Sydney Airport, which has had both a cap and a curfew since 1997. Now, despite recent attacks against communities by the Queensland Deputy Premier, this is not a NIMBY attitude. In fact, when introducing his private member's bill to tackle flight noise in Sydney, it was the current Prime Minister that said, "I am tired of those who say this debate is about inner-city people wanting to dump their problems somewhere else." The East Coast Corridor contains 3 of the busiest air routes in the world. Instead of tripling flight movements by 2050, we should look to decarbonise our travel and finally build high-speed rail in this country. But since the sell-off of our major airports and our national carrier in the 90s, we've now created an extremely powerful corporate lobby group. A lobby group that has fought to prevent noise protections and fought against high-speed rail in order to maintain their profits. Ultimately, this fight is led by the community, by people speaking up against the greed of big corporations and the major parties that sit in the back pocket of airline corporations. The community is tired of playing by rules for the airports designed by the airports. The Greens will always stand with the community in that fight against big corporations.
Thank the member for Brisbane. Is the motion seconded? Call the member for Melbourne.
Thank you, Speaker. I second the motion and reserve my right to speak.
Thank you. The question is the motion be agreed to, and I call the member for Moreton.
Thanks, Speaker. I rise to speak on the motion brought by the member for Brisbane, and in doing so I want to acknowledge that every member of this House advocates for their constituents, and I have no doubt that the member is attempting to do this for his constituents. And while decrying the fact that it's not inner-city people advocating for something, I point out that there are 2 inner-city MPs with petitions that would put more planes over my electorate. In fact, over my house, over my own house, because I know aircraft noise is an issue for many Greater Brisbane residents. I, in fact, used to live in Tarragindi under the flight path of the old runway, and I now live in Moorooka under the new runway flight path. So when I look up from my house, I see planes flying directly overhead. And I also get Archerfield planes doing touch-and-go circuits, as well as emergency care flight helicopters and police returning to their base at Archerfield. So aircraft noise is not a theoretical concept used to clickbait and data harvest for me. It is personal. But as leaders and lawmakers, we're here with a responsibility to the nation to put aside the temptation to score cheap political victories and consider the broader impacts of our actions on all those they would affect. A curfew at Brisbane Airport threatens to kill Brisbane's only Qatar Airways service, as well as impact international carriers such as Singapore, Emirates, Fiji Airways, Cathay Pacific, EVA, China Airlines, Vietjet, Jetstar and Qantas. Domestically, regional Queensland will be the most impacted with 3,100 reduced flights. On the ground, this means that families and loved ones who live in regional Queensland, and remember, we are the most decentralised state, will not be able to visit as often or as easily or in some circumstances at all. In fact, much of the overnight cargo flights that leave Brisbane Airport are headed to regional Queensland, and they're carrying things like fresh produce or mechanical parts for farming equipment. They carry critical medical and pharmaceutical supplies, including cancer medications for some of the most remote communities in Queensland. So this Greens bill would make Queensland the only state where next-day delivery of time-sensitive items cannot be guaranteed. Are we really prepared to tell some Australians, particularly Queenslanders, that because of an inconvenience visited on some Brisbane residents affected by aircraft noise, and as I said, I live right underneath this pathway, this will outweigh their need for life-saving medical products? At a time when Australians' demand for air services is high, I'm sure that the member for Brisbane didn't come here by train or drive down. The simple fact remains that less capacity will cause a surge in fare prices and make air travel less affordable, not just for Brisbane residents, but for people in regional Queensland and northern New South Wales, interstate travellers and beyond. Currently, 75% of all Queensland tourism arrivals come through Brisbane Airport. As an island nation, geographically removed from much of the rest of the world, we're already at a disadvantage when it comes to attracting international travellers, and a curfew would only disadvantage us further. This is not just about Brisbane residents experiencing the impacts of aircraft noise. The bill affects the cafe and restaurant owners, it affects bar workers, the tourism workers, the airport workers, the member for Brisbane's former retail colleagues and many, many more. In fact, job losses of some 30,000 by 2032 across the aviation, tourism, logistics and resource sectors could be expected if a curfew were to be implemented. And obviously 2032 is the year of the Olympics. It would be a strange statement to the rest of the world. For context, 30,000 jobs is more job losses than there are currently employees at Brisbane Airport. Economic losses to the tune of $2.82 billion could also be expected. But it's not just passenger fares that would increase, it's the cost of imported goods, online purchases that everyday Queenslanders purchase and which come in from overseas. It's the everyday household items that would also increase in price. So I do genuinely sympathise with those who experience aircraft noise. I meet with them regularly. I have representatives on the Brisbane Airport committee and the committee convened by Minister King. But during a cost of living crisis, it is extremely difficult to justify any action that would put further strain on hard-working constituents that I represent by saying that airline prices must go up. We are talking about people, particularly low to middle income earners, the renters, the students, many people that I'm sure the member for Brisbane does care about. We need to get the balance right. But if you want a place where there are no aircraft, you shouldn't be living in the middle of Brisbane.
Thank the member for Moreton. The question is that the motion be agreed to, and I call the member for Melbourne.
Deputy Speaker, many members of the public who aren't affected by aircraft noise may think it's only an issue that affects people who live near airports, and many of them it affects greatly. But what I want to tell the House is that in Melbourne, and in East Melbourne in particular, it's currently Rafferty's rules in the skies above East Melbourne. And aircraft noise is a very, very real problem for people who live there. If you think about East Melbourne, for those who don't know, it's an area that's right next to the MCG. And one of the things that this means is that there are routinely helicopters that come in and fly and loop around the MCG to have a look at it, to film what's going on. But it's not just helicopters who come in and do the loop around the MCG, keeping a distance so that they can get a view inside, which of course puts them right over people's houses at a very low height. It's also small fixed-wing aircraft that come in for tourist reasons, so that people can have a look at the MCG or have a look at Melbourne. They also come in and fly and do circles around the MCG, keeping a bit of distance from the centre, flying right over people's houses. But it is also aircraft that take off from Moorabbin and Essendon, who come in, do a loop around the city because the MCG is a recognised landmark, do a loop and then fly back, perhaps to clock up their training hours, perhaps for some other reasons. That adds to it as well. And so when you look at a map of flights over East Melbourne, it's a whirlpool centred around the MCG. It's a twisted tangle of spaghetti of flights flying over and over in a completely unregulated manner as far as the impact on the residents is concerned. And then you add to that a change that was made several years ago for large aircraft that was savaged by the Aircraft Noise Ombudsman for failing to consult the residents, where flight paths and gathering points for large aircraft now come in basically broadly over the IKEA over in Richmond and then line up one after the other to come in over the city before turning north and then heading into Melbourne Airport. Add all of those things together and the fact that governments over the years have completely ignored regulation of our skies when it comes to residents who might not live near an airport but will be affected by flight paths, and you have, for many, many people who live in East Melbourne, an almost unbearable situation on some days. Residents have told me of the windows shaking, the noise that means you can't go outside into your backyard, the effect that it is having on people's mental health, to the point where some people have said to me, it's like it disrupts your ability to just live a normal life. This is not what people signed up for, and at the moment it is completely unregulated. Now, the people who live there have pushed and pushed and pushed against some very powerful interests who say, oh, well, we're not going to do anything about it because it is more important for people to be able to fly wherever they want than for people to have a good night's sleep or to enjoy life in their homes. And they have pushed and pushed and pushed. And as a result of that community pressure, with the Greens working side by side, we've secured something very significant from the Minister. And I thank the Minister for her action on this, because there will now be a task force that is aimed at better understanding the issue and determining operating procedures that will better protect residents from overflight. This could make a very big difference if some changes to flight paths are made, and not changes that push the problem onto other people, but changes that, for example, could end up with leisure flights flying down the river or over the rail yards instead of over people's houses, so everyone could still get a good look at Melbourne but not impact on residents. Changes to flight paths that could see flights coming in and turning at a different point, not over people's houses. So again, you don't push the problem onto other people, but you ensure that resident amenity is protected. And I want to acknowledge Greg Bisanella, Shelley Falble, Matt Falble, Ian Mitchell, Susan Henderson, David Woodward, Jennifer Owen, and everyone else in the East Melbourne group and all the other people in East Melbourne who've not taken no for an answer, who have pushed and pushed and pushed. We are starting to see progress, and now we need to see action.
I thank the member for Melbourne. The question is the motion be agreed to, and I call the member for Hawke.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Australia needs a healthy and productive aviation sector to support our economy, and there's so many jobs across the many industries that rely upon it. The vastness of Australia inevitably means we rely heavily on aviation for our internal movements as well as to maintain our connections to the outside world. My community has a long history in aviation. It started in Diggers Rest with one of the first ever flights to take off in this country, to the many jobs and employment opportunities that the Melbourne Airport Precinct provides for my community now. Adjacent to the Melbourne Airport, directly adjacent to the Melbourne Airport, my electorate of Hawke, including Sunbury, Bulla and the surrounding areas, knows all too well the impact that our aviation sector has on communities. Now more than ever, we need to support workers in the aviation sector and its supporting industries, because it brings the opportunities and jobs that sustain places like my community. And these jobs flow on to sustain our local economies within the suburbs and the towns nearby. Deputy Speaker, 18,000 people are directly employed across the Melbourne Airport Precinct, and it supports a further 146,000 jobs across the country, rather across the community. From cafes and eateries, retail spots, to the administration staff and the proud road transport workers who connect our airport to the rest of the country, its community and its economy. The freight task alone represents 205 million tonnes of freight worth $22 billion, around 30% of all of Australia's air freight. The airport is an economic lifeblood of our community, so it requires appropriate oversight from government to ensure that we get the best outcomes. We know what happens when governments abandon these communities. When they don't back in workers, they put them at risk of being left behind. We've seen this in recent years, like when the former Liberal government watched on while Qantas illegally sacked 1,700 workers in the middle of the pandemic. That's 1,700 families put through hell, all the time while the Liberals were handing out $2 billion in taxpayer-funded handouts to the very same company. It's no surprise that many workers, including many of those in my electorate, took them all the way to the High Court, supported by the mighty Transport Workers Union, and won. The Liberals have consistently shown their colours when it comes to the treatment of workers in this sector. Now, when it comes to noise, the Albanese government understands the concerns raised about airport developments across the country. Just as we understand the noise impacts in Brisbane, we know it impacts communities everywhere. When it comes to the proposed third runway for Melbourne Airport, we're working with the community, with the operators and the airport to look at the best solutions to minimise the impact of flights on communities under flight paths. This will mean that greater consideration will be given when these decisions are made to address the concerns raised. This work forms a broader picture in this space, where the Albanese government is working to provide clarity and forward-thinking for the future of the industry. The Aviation White Paper will set the long-term policies that will guide us through this next phase of rapidly increasing growth and innovation in the aviation sector, so that everyone in our community and across our economy can enjoy the jobs that that brings. It will lay out the government's vision for policies on safety, competitiveness, sustainability and efficiency to ensure that the sector is best positioned to continue delivering aviation services for the Australian public, all while looking forward to 2050 and the challenges that that will bring. One of the key issues it'll address is enhancing the mechanisms for consultation and on management of issues such as aircraft noise and the redevelopment of airports across the country. This will go a long way to ensuring communities, just like mine, get the best possible outcomes, both in terms of jobs and minimisation of aircraft noise. It's what responsible governments do: consult widely and work closely with the community to deliver on the promises and reforms that will leave a lasting legacy. We know how important the aviation sector is to our economy, to jobs and staying connected, and it's why it's so important that we'll get it right.
Thank the member for Hawke. The time a lot of this debate has expired. The debate is therefore adjourned and the resumption of the debate will be made in order of the day for the next